Welcome to Libeth. I'm glad you're here. This week we are in ancient Japan with the Kojiki. Today we look at how the Kojiki is built, the shape of its story, and what that shape means. Yesterday, we read the Kojiki together. Today I want to look at something different, not what the story tells, but how it tells it. Because the way this text is built says something that the story itself never quite says out loud. There is a version of literary analysis that treats form as merely decorative, the container that holds the content, chosen for convenience and largely irrelevant to meaning. The Kojiki refuses that view at every turn. Its form is its argument. The way it is organized, the genres it mixes, the narrative logic it employs, the tonal registers it moves between, all of these are not incidental to what the text is trying to do. They are the primary mechanism by which it does it. Understanding how the Kojiki is built is not preparatory to understanding what it means. It is the understanding. Start with the most basic question. What kind of text is the Kojiki? If you try to answer that question cleanly, you find your hands full almost immediately. It is a creation myth. The world is made in its opening pages, and the making of the world is the necessary precondition for everything that follows. But it is also a divine genealogy. Its central concern is the unbroken chain of descent from Amaterasu, the sun goddess, down through semi-divine ancestors to the human imperial line. And that chain is rehearsed and extended with painstaking care across all three of its volumes. It is also a chronicle. It records, or claims to record, the reigns and deeds of the early emperors with a specificity that presents itself as historical. And it is a poetry anthology. Embedded within the prose narrative are more than 100 poems, in an archaic literary Japanese entirely different in register and diction from the narrative surrounding them, preserved because the court valued them as cultural monuments, and because oral poetry was one of the primary means by which the traditions the Kojiki was compiling had been transmitted in the first place. These four functions, creation myth, divine genealogy, chronicle, poetry anthology, do not sit in the text as separate sections, cleanly divided and labeled. They are woven together, one giving way to another and then returning, the prose suddenly interrupted by a poem, the chronicle suddenly expanding into mythological narrative when a lineage needs to be traced back to its divine origin. Western readers who arrive expecting the kind of unified narrative voice they find in the Iliad, where a single authorial persona sustains a consistent register from the invocation to the closing lines, will find the Kojiki disorienting. There is no single voice. There are many voices, many registers, many purposes, and the text makes no apology for that multiplicity because, for the compilers, that multiplicity was not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be reflected. The Kojiki is a patchwork because the oral traditions it drew from were a patchwork. The seams are visible because honoring the different sources meant allowing them to remain themselves. But here is where it becomes interesting. That patchwork is also a political argument. All belong to the same single story about where Japan came from and who has the right to govern it. Diversity of source is made to look like unity of origin. Different traditions are woven into a single tapestry, whose center is always the imperial line. The form is an act of political consolidation, dressed in the language of cultural preservation. The compiler's choices, what to include and what to omit, which version of a story to preserve and which to allow to disappear, are exercises of power as much as acts of scholarship. The Kojiki's architecture, its large-scale organizational logic, is large and deliberate. It is divided into 3 volumes, and that division is not arbitrary. The first volume, conventionally called the Age of the Gods, or Cameo, covers the creation of the world, the birth of the islands of Japan, and the divine dramas that precede human history. The union of Izanagi and Izanami, the birth and death of Izanami, the descent to Yomi, the purification that produces Amaterasu and her siblings, the cave episode, the descent of Ninigi to the earthly realm. This volume is the most overtly mythological. Its events take place in a time before human time, among beings who are categorically divine, and its narrative logic is the logic of cosmogony rather than history. It establishes the sacred ground on which everything that follows will stand. The second and third volumes move into what presents itself as history, the reigns of the early emperors, their campaigns and marriages and genealogies, the founding of shrines, and the settlement of territories. The transition from divine to human is not abrupt. The early emperors are semi-divine figures, descended from the gods only a few generations back, and the miraculous continues to happen around them. Kami appear in dreams, divine swords are discovered, sacred fires are ignited without human agency. But the texture of the narrative shifts. There is more attention to specific places, specific family relationships, specific political events. The chronicle mode begins to dominate, even as the mythological remains available, and is invoked whenever a lineage needs to be anchored in divine origin. Those genealogical lists that occupy significant portions of the second and third volumes, the long catalogues of emperors, their consorts, their children, the dates of their reigns, can feel, to a modern reader, like the least interesting parts of the text. They are, in fact, the most politically loaded. Each name inserted into that chain is a claim. Each generation that links a clan to Amaterasu is an argument for that clan's place in the political order. The genealogies are not padding. They are the law text, the document that determines who has ritual authority, who has land rights, who has precedence in the court hierarchy. Reading them as mere lists misses the point. They are arguments rendered in the form of names. Look at where the book opens and where it stops. It opens in a cosmogonic register of extraordinary strangeness. Before the world has shape, in a state of chaos that the Japanese text describes with an image of something like floating oil or a jellyfish drifting in darkness. And the first gods emerge from that state of their own accord, unnamed and formless, concealing themselves immediately. The opening pages have an impersonal, almost incantatory quality. They do not invite identification or narrative engagement in the way a novel's opening does. They demand a different kind of attention, the attention you give to liturgy, to the recitation of things that are true in a way that precedes argument. The text ends not in a final cosmic resolution, but in the present tense of its commissioners. The reign of Empress Suiko, who died in 628 CE, within living memory of the oldest people alive when the Kojiki was compiled in 712. To end, there is to make a point that is impossible to miss. The story of the gods is not remote history. It continues into the now. The divine chain that began in the primordial chaos extends without interruption to the woman who was empress less than a century before this document was produced. The structure, cosmic preface to immediate present, is an argument for continuity, for the unbroken persistence of the sacred order through the full length of Japanese history, making the authority of the current imperial line feel not like a political fact, but like a cosmological one. The architecture insists that the past is not over. It is still operative. If structure is the scaffolding, then narrative logic is the toolkit the text uses to make things happen within it. And the logic of the Kojiki is one of the places where modern readers most often lose their footing, because the causality works so differently from what we are accustomed to. In a modern novel or film, events happen because characters make choices, and those choices follow from comprehensible psychology. Motive leads to action, leads to consequence. The chain of causation is visible and generally proportional. A character's decision produces effects appropriate to its magnitude. In the Kojiki, this logic is present, but it is not the primary logic. Alongside it, and sometimes displacing it entirely, is a mythic causation in which acts, gestures, utterances, and especially violations of ritual order carry ontological weight that is independent of intention or scale. A small gesture can produce enormous consequences. A prohibited act can unmake a relationship between the living and the dead. A ritual word can reorganize the structure of the cosmos. Consider the most famous single act of causation in the entire text. Izanagi's looking at Izanami in the darkness of Yomi. He has descended to the underworld to retrieve his dead wife. She tells him to wait, that she must negotiate with the gods of that place, and she asks him, explicitly and emphatically, not to look at her. He waits. He grows anxious. He breaks off the end tooth of the comb he is wearing in his hair and lights it as a torch. He looks, and what he sees destroys everything. Her body in an advanced state of decomposition, thunder deities generated from the different stages of her decay, the horror of what death actually does to a body. He flees. She pursues him in fury. The entrance to Yomi is blocked with a great stone. Izanami declares that she will kill 1,000 people per day. Izanagi replies that he will ensure 1,500 births. Death and life are separated, and the relationship between the primal creative couple is severed permanently. What caused this catastrophe? A single look, in defiance of a prohibition. Not a war, not a great crime, not a sustained failure of character. One moment of anxiety, one impulse toward the beloved that he could not control, one small physical act, the breaking off of a comb tooth to make a torch, and the cosmos is permanently reorganized. The scale of the consequence is entirely disproportionate to the scale of the act in any human logic. But in the mythic logic of the Kojiki, the act is not small. A ritual prohibition is not a social convention. It is a structural element of cosmic order, and violating it breaks the structure. The consequences are proportional not to the physical magnitude of the act, but to its ontological significance. This pattern recurs throughout the text. Tsukuyomi kills a food goddess not in a battle or a quarrel of any significant duration, but because he is revolted by the way she prepares a banquet, by producing food from her own body, and he strikes her down on the spot. The consequence, Amaterasu declares she will never look at him again, and day and night are separated. The physical act takes a few lines. The consequence is the permanent structure of the sky. Or consider Suzanu's rampage in the heavens, not a sustained military campaign, but a series of acts that take, in narrative time, a matter of hours. He fills in the irrigation ditches, scatters excrement in the sacred halls, hurls a flayed horse into the weaving room. The consequence? Amaterasu hides in a cave. The world goes dark, malevolent spirits run unchecked across the land, and the entire assembly of the gods must gather to devise a way to restore order. A few hours of destructive behavior produces a crisis of cosmic proportions. This is the Kojiki's moral and causal economy. The world is held together by the correct performance of acts, by the maintenance of ritual distinctions, by the honoring of taboos, and it can come apart very quickly when those things fail. The appropriate response to that precariousness is not heroic individual virtue in the Western sense, but meticulous ritual attention. The ongoing maintenance of relationships with the kami, the correct performance of purification when contamination has occurred, the perpetuation of the genealogical chains and shrine obligations that keep the sacred order legible and functional. This is a world in which civilization is not a natural condition, but an achievement that must be continuously reproduced by human and divine effort, and that can fail, sometimes catastrophically, sometimes from a single small violation at any moment. A modern reader who understands this logic will hear the text differently. Stop asking why in the way a novelist means it. Why did the character make this choice given their psychology and circumstances? And start asking what kind of world this is, in which this kind of consequence follows from this kind of act. The answer is a world in which the boundary between the sacred and the profane is always under pressure, always requiring maintenance, and always capable of collapsing if not properly attended to. That is not an irrational world. It is a world organized around a different understanding of where meaning lies, not in individual intention, but in collective ritual practice and its ongoing maintenance. Tone in the Kojiki is one of the most immediately noticeable features of the text, and one of the most revealing. The opening cosmogony carries an impersonal, vast, almost liturgical register. It reads like an account of the world's latticework unfolding from some perspective that is neither human nor divine, but simply ontological, prior to perspective itself. There is no narrator who is moved or frightened or curious. There is only the world coming into being. That impersonal register persists through the earliest episodes of divine genealogy, the births of the primordial gods, the creation of the islands, before the text shifts gear entirely with the story of Izanagi and Izanami. The Izanagi and Izanami episodes introduce something completely different: intimacy. Their relationship is rendered with a domestic specificity that is psychologically acute. They speak to each other. They make mistakes in ritual procedure and have to be corrected. They grieve. The scene of Izanaga's descent to Yomi to retrieve his wife is not epic in register. It is domestic tragedy. The language is not inflated or grandiose. It is quiet and specific. He breaks off a comb tooth to make a light. He looks. He runs. She chases him. The detail of the comb is characteristic of the Kojiki's most effective moments. A small, precise, entirely ordinary object that grounds a cosmological event in the texture of everyday life. Then the text shifts again into the Susanoo material, and the tonal change is dramatic. The Susanoo episodes, his weeping for his dead mother, his rampage in heaven, his descent to Izumo, his encounter with the Orachi serpent, move with a wild, anarchic energy. The language is visceral and at moments grotesque. The flayed horse, the excrement scattered in the sacred halls, the serpent drunk on sake and cut to pieces. There is dark comedy in the Susanoo material alongside the horror. The gods confronted with excrement in a sacred space. The elaborate plan to get a monster drunk on rice wine. The tone is unpredictable in a way that feels alive. That resists the solemnity of the cosmogonic opening and the pathos of the Izanagi and Izanami sections. After the Susanoo material, the text transitions into the cave episode, Amaterasu's withdrawal from the world and the communal performance that draws her out, which has its own distinctive register. Collective, comedic, almost festive in its solution to a cosmic crisis. The gods dance. They laugh. The crowd laughs. Amaterasu's curiosity overcomes her anger. It is an episode that insists on the communal rather than the heroic as the mechanism of cosmic repair. And its tone, warm, irreverent, slightly absurd, is entirely different from anything that precedes it. And then the later imperial sections, the chronicle mode of volumes 2 and 3, bring something closer to administrative sobriety. Lists, dates, genealogical tables, records of marriages and campaigns and shrine foundations, punctuated at irregular intervals by poems that break through the prose like sudden light through clouds. Those poems are in an entirely different linguistic register, more archaic, more compressed, more reliant on the emotional resonance of nature imagery. And they arrive without warning, demanding a different kind of listening than the genealogical lists that surround them. These tonal shifts are not inconsistencies to be explained away. They are fingerprints of the different oral traditions and social contexts from which the Kojiki's material was drawn. The ritual specialists who preserved the cosmogony used one voice. The family bards, who sang the intimate tragedies of the divine couple, used another. The local storytellers, who kept alive the wild legends of the storm god, used a third. The court scribes who recorded the imperial succession used a fourth. The Kojiki collects all of those voices and, crucially, does not flatten them into a single register. It allows them to remain themselves. The result is a text that sounds, at different moments, like liturgy and like gossip, like tragedy and like farce, like the recitation of a legal document, and like the song someone sings when they are overwhelmed by love. That tonal variety is the Kojiki's deepest form of fidelity to its sources. And it produces, for the reader or listener, a psychological training that is itself one of the text's gifts. An expectation of complexity, an ability to hear the world as layered rather than simple, sacred and comic and bureaucratic all at once. The silences in the Kojiki are as structurally significant as its contents. What the text omits defines it as precisely as what it includes, and the pattern of its omissions is not random. The most striking omission is Buddhism. The Kojiki was compiled in 712 CE, at the height of the Nara period, when Buddhism was the official religion of the imperial court, when monumental Buddhist temples were under construction across the country, when Buddhist monks held official state appointments, and Buddhist ritual was woven into government ceremony. The emperor who reigned when the Kojiki was completed, Genmei, was a patron of Buddhism. The successor states of the Korean kingdoms from which Buddhism had come were still in close diplomatic contact with the Japanese court. Buddhist thought had been reshaping the intellectual landscape of Japanese elite culture for a century and a half. And the Kojiki does not mention it once. Not a single kami is identified with a Buddhist deity. Not a single passage reflects Buddhist cosmological categories. The word Buddha does not appear. The word Dharma does not appear. This is not an oversight. It is a decision made by the compilers, presumably with the approval of the court that commissioned them, to produce a text that establishes the indigenous sacred framework as the ground of imperial legitimacy, without acknowledging the religion that was simultaneously underwriting the court's spiritual life. The Kojiki is, among other things, an act of deliberate religious memory. It preserves the old sacred order, the kami cosmology, the genealogical claim of divine descent, as if Buddhism had not arrived. That act of selective preservation is a form of cultural assertion. Whatever else we have imported and adopted, this is what we are. The silence about China and Korea follows the same logic. The historical record makes clear that Japan's relations with the Asian continent were formative. The Ritsuryo codes were modeled on Tang administrative law. Buddhist scripture came from China and Korea. The writing system itself was borrowed. Yet the Kojiki presents the islands of Japan as formed by an act of indigenous divine creation, makes the kami the primary agents of the world's structure, and says almost nothing about the continental cultures whose material and intellectual contributions shaped the world that produced the text. This is not ignorance. It is argument. The Kojiki insists on indigenous origin and indigenous authority, even as it is written in a hybrid script that required a continental technology to exist. The tension between those two things, between the fact of cultural borrowing and the assertion of cultural self-sufficiency, is one of the most interesting things about the document and one of the most politically consequential. The common people are also largely absent. The farmers, the fishermen, the artisans, the senmen who handled the ritually impure work of death and blood and tanning. When a text concerned with the origin of the world and the foundation of its social order omits the majority of the people who live in that world, that omission is itself a statement about what matters. The Kojiki was not written to give voice to the full range of human experience in early Japan. It was written to anchor the authority of the imperial line and the great clans in a sacred past. And the life of Hiro the farmer or Ira the tanner is simply not part of that project. Their invisibility in the text is a precise reflection of their invisibility in the political order the text was designed to support. To understand what is distinctive about the Kojiki, it helps to stand it briefly alongside the founding myths of other civilizations, not to flatten the differences, but to see what each set of choices reveals. Compare it to Genesis. Both begin with watery chaos and a divine creative act. Both move from cosmic origins through genealogy toward kingship and the establishment of a chosen lineage. But in Genesis, the God who creates does not err. The humans err. The divine is perfect and transcendent. The human is fallible and earthly. In the Kojiki, the gods who create are themselves created. They emerge from the chaos, they have parents, they fall in love, they die. Izanagi makes a mistake in the purification that produces Susanoo. Amaterasu is frightened into hiding. The cosmos itself is fallible, produced by beings who are powerful but not omniscient and not immune to grief. The theological implications are profound. If the source of all things is itself imperfect and emotionally complex, then perfection is not the standard by which human life should be measured, and failure is not a fall from a prior state of grace, but an inherent feature of a world made by beings who were themselves learning what they were doing. Compare it to Hesiod's theogony. Both organize the gods through genealogy. Both trace the legitimacy of a present political order back to primordial acts of cosmic generation. But where Hesiod is interested primarily in the power dynamics among divine factions, in who overthrows whom and who seizes which domain, the Kojiki is interested in the continuous line of descent that connects the present rulers to the first gods. The Theogony is a text about divine succession as political struggle. The Kojiki is a text about divine descent as political legitimacy. The narrative emphasis is different because the political problem being solved is different. Compare it to the Popol Vuh of the Kayich, Maya. Both are founding myths produced at the intersection of cosmology and political authority. Both mix creation, narrative with dynastic genealogy. Both were produced in contexts where indigenous oral tradition was being fixed into writing under political pressure, with the goal of establishing an authoritative version of the past that could support a particular ruling group's claims. The parallel between the situation of the Kojiki's compilers in Nara, Japan, and the situation of the Popol Vuh's authors in colonial-era Guatemala is striking. In both cases, a political elite used the technology of writing to encode and legitimize an oral tradition that might otherwise have been dispersed, suppressed, or lost. What the Kojiki shares with all of these texts, and with the Mahabharata, and with the Mesopotamian creation myths, and with the Norse prose Edda, is the universality of the need they answer. The need to know where we came from, to ground the present in a sacred past, and to make the current arrangement of power feel like something other than an accident of force. What each text does differently is tell you something about the civilization that produced it, about its particular anxieties, its specific conception of the relationship between divine and human, its understanding of what kind of story can make authority feel legitimate. The Kojiki's answer to those questions is distinctive. An authority that is legitimate because it descends from the gods, maintained by ongoing ritual, vulnerable to violation, and inseparable from the sacred geography of the Japanese islands. That is a different answer from the Theogony's answer, and from Genesis's answer, and from the Popol Vuh's answer. Understanding the difference is one of the things studying the Kojiki is good for. That's all for today on Libeth. Now we turn to the characters, the gods and figures who carry this story, and what they reveal. If you want to follow the whole journey, subscribe, a new book every week. At least we try.